So the first question to answer is probably, why do a Q&A video now?
Why not 20 years ago?
And the honest answer is, I just thought it'd be fun. And you guys asked a lot of really great questions, so I think we'll just jump right into it. If you had to pick one, which would you choose? You can no longer watch movies made before the year 1970, including rewatches, or you can no longer watch movies made after the year 1970, also including rewatches. So we're starting off with an evil question. There's no good answer to this. No matter what I choose, I lose magnitudes of great art, and it pains me to let either side go. I will go with keeping my ability to watch films made from 1970 onwards. This way I at least keep most of the new Hollywood. I keep a lot of the great final films from the international auteurs of the mid-century and their great final works. I get entire careers of some of my favorite filmmakers. There's a lot of reasons to make this my choice, but the prevailing one is quite simply that for as much as I might complain about the modern state of cinema and everything wrong with it and wax poetic about the glory days of old, the simple fact is being cut off from contemporary film culture would cut me off from so much of culture more broadly. Going to the theater is my favorite thing to do. And yes, I theoretically, if I chose the opposite, could still do rep screenings of classic Hollywood films and the great international triumphs, but those are far less common than just new releases being shown in theaters, and taking that away from me would seriously rob my life of so much joy. So I will choose to forego all films made before the 1970s, even though it absolutely pains me to do this, and I resent this question on a deep level. If you could be a fly on the wall for any film production, which would you choose? My mind immediately goes to the late period New Hollywood films, the sort of infamous auteur mad, hubristic enterprises that wasted money by the hundreds of thousands. Those are the productions I really want to see. The train wrecks. I think the obvious answer would be Apocalypse Now, but given all of the challenges the crew faced in terms of weather, in terms of sickness, in terms of heat stroke, I don't want to risk my health too much, so I think I'll say either 1941 or New York, New York, because you still get to witness a cocaine-fueled train wreck of a production where everything is going wrong and money is burning at all moments, but you're also shooting in the controlled environment of a studio, so I'm less likely to get food poisoning. Who is a classic Hollywood actor that you never could connect with or understand why they were so revered? Bing Crosby comes to mind. I've seen a couple of his films. I've actually seen a decent amount of his films, and he's fine. He has enough of a screen presence that I'm not totally surprised he was a star, but he's never really done it for me, and most of his films strike me as pretty middling at best and other times actively quite bad. That said, I've never seen any of the Road to films that he made with Bob Hope, things like The Road to Morocco, which seem like some of his more beloved stuff and obviously are comedies and pretty light. So I might, if I saw those, change my tune on Bing, but for now, he stands out as a star who I've never really connected to. What's some film blind spots, as in eras, countries, etc., that you haven't explored much at all, but you'd really want to dedicate the time to? Have you considered watching any cinema from Finland or movies by Aki Kaurismäki? What has been your experience with Hindi cinema, or even Indian cinema at large? Any favorite films, directors, or even modern post-2000s classics? So I'm grouping all these together because they're addressing a similar idea of blind spots, and especially kind of geographical blind spots, because Finnish cinema, complete blind spot. I don't think I've seen a single real Finnish movie. Indian cinema, I have more familiarity with, given I have some experience with films from people like Myra Nair and Satyajit Ray, but still pretty minimal, and even from the two of them, I've only seen a couple of their bigger movies. I'm not by any means dove into their works fully, and modern Indian cinema especially, basically a complete blind spot. I saw RRR, that one was pretty unavoidable, but for the most part, Indian cinema is a cinema that I am unfamiliar with. I've also seen remarkably little cinema from Africa, an entire continent that I just have barely any exposure to outside of a handful of major titles. And there are all sorts of other pockets of international cinema that I would love to be able to more fully learn about and experience, which is kind of great, honestly, as much as it's can be daunting to think that there's so much out there that one hasn't engaged with. It's also really exciting. There's always more cinema to discover and learn and obsess over, and it's very humbling that even if you consider yourself someone who, you've seen your fair share of movies, you know your way around the art house, you still probably have massive blind spots. I certainly do. In terms of which ones I'd really like to fill, Indian cinema is definitely a big one, especially because you run the gamut from, art house, prestige movies of the likes of a Ray or a Nair, but also these kind of bombastic, spectacular, blockbuster entertainments. So you get a really thorough range. In terms of the other factor I want to bring up, though, is not so much complete blind spots, but more fleshing out areas that I'm generally familiar with. Because there are certainly countries or time periods whose cinema I'm sort of generally familiar with, and I've seen some of the heavy hitters, but not nearly as much as I should. Like, I've seen a lot of the major French New Wave titles. I've not seen all of them, and there are certainly more obscure ones that I would like to get into. As far as an era like that I'd really want to flesh out, the golden age of Japanese cinema, that 50s, 60s art house run really comes to mind. I'm pretty much seen everything from Kurosawa and most of the majors from Ozu and Mitsuguchi, but not all of them. Ozu especially, I do still need a lot of work in. And I would also like to get into the kind of secondary run of filmmakers from that era in Japan who don't necessarily have the legacy of your Kurosawas or Ozus, but who were doing really great, interesting work that is worthy of facing. In your opinion, what was more responsible for the end of the new Hollywood era? The success of movies like Jaws and Star Wars, or the failure of movies like Heaven's Gate and One from the Heart? I would say underlining both of these things is a general shift in how films were distributed in America and how they were marketed, and specifically the shift from a kind of regional, slow rollout of movies that would be released in certain markets and build word of mouth before expanding and playing other cities and other markets to what we now recognize as our modern opening weekend global mass release, where films are opening on 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 screens on its opening weekend across not just the country, but across the US, across Canada, in many places of the world. Opening weekend, everything becoming fixated on that, and accompanying that, the sort of surge of marketing required to make that possible, and especially the saturation of TV markets and TV channels and TV spots as a means to sell movies. Because I think less than the success of these movies or the failure of those movies, it's more how these changes in movie exhibition change the conditions for which kinds of films could thrive and succeed. Jaws is a movie you can sell in a 30-second TV spot. Shark Attacks Beach. How can you sell One from the Heart in a 30-second TV spot? Star Wars is a movie that can become an instant sensation on an opening weekend. Heaven's Gate is not. Sorcerer is not. Apocalypse Now is not. Bonnie and Clyde, the film that is, I think, correctly credited as being the real inception moment for the new Hollywood. If you look at its release in 1967, it was a slow build starting in the summer. It was never really a full-blown, hit movie. Bonnie and Clyde, in the environment of Hollywood by the 1980, could not be a sensation because of the changes in how films were made. And I think or rather how films were released. I think that's really the fundamental change. Which kinds of films were privileged to succeed in that paradigm, and which ones were disadvantaged? What are some collaborators, be it between actors, directors, screenwriters, composers, etc., that never happened that you would have loved to have seen? I would have loved to see Orson Welles play a villain in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. I just think that would have been really fun. I have a question regarding films that end the need for certain genres, not because of box office failure, but because they reach the thematic endpoint that could be reached, like you explained with Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America. What are some similar films? The other genre that you see this with a lot is westerns, which are also bound in mythology, are also tied to a very specific historical time period, a historical time period which ends and transitions into another era. So many westerns are grappling with these kinds of ideas at both a explicit textual level along with a subtextual level, and there's lots of different examples I can cite. The one that comes to mind right now is Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch. Like Once Upon a Time in America, it's really engaging in a kind of barbarousness in this genre. It's portraying the violence that's always been inherent in these movies with a degree of not just graphic bloodshed and carnage, but a kind of cruelty and beastly nature that kind of strips it of a lot of its heroic myth-making. But it's doubly interesting because Peckinpah, one of the first films he makes is a western called Ride the High Country, which has some of this kind of cynicism as well, but is made in a much more classical Hollywood film style, and has a main character who is trying to live up to the ideals of what the Western hero, what the great cowboy in a cowboy movie should be. And so to see the Wild Bunch as an extension of Peckinpah's earlier attempts in the genre with Ride the High Country makes it even more fascinating, and it makes it doubly fascinating as Peckinpah makes other westerns in the 70s like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, but also movies like Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia or Straw Dogs, which are not westerns but are very much tapping into a similar language, similar kinds of narratives, similar kinds of obsessions on Peckinpah's part. So yeah, I would say that's a film. If you were interested in the analysis I did on Once Upon a Time in America and want a film that will give you similar things to chew on, I'd say Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, especially if you also watch Ride the High Country and some of the films he makes in the 70s following. I think that'll really enrich that kind of viewing. If you had to update the AFI Top 100, what films would you add, and more interesting, what films would you get rid of? I mean, you can go through my top 100 and get a pretty good sense of which films I would add. My main goal, of course, would be getting The Manchurian Candidate back in there. You had it in there before, guys. Just leave it. In terms of which films I'd get rid of, there's honestly a ton if I was strictly just doing films that I think are the 100 greatest American films of all time. But in terms of the ones that immediately jump to mind, Gone with the Wind. I realize it's a canonized American cinema classic, but I mean, there's a lot there that is fraught, and I just think even beyond that, I have issues with the film, even though its aspects of it are obviously very impressive on a technical level and in the performances. The African Queen, gone in a flash. I don't know why that's there to begin with, and certainly why it's so high in the initial list. And another possibly controversial omission on my part, or excision rather, The Sound of Music. It represents so much of the musical genre's ultimate decline, even if it at the time seemed like it was such a great peak for the genre in terms of box office and popularity. But those kind of laborious roadshow epic musicals are kind of antithetical to what I want from the genre, and I just think that movie is kind of a bore. Robert Wise's West Side Story completely puts it to shame. In your opinion, what is the greatest film that was never made? So these kind of mythologized films that go into production or are in some form of development that ended up never being made, they're fun stories, but often I find if you look, one of the narratives that always comes out is the films that did get made instead. Like, we don't get Jodorowsky's Dune, but from the ashes of that, we get Alien. And isn't the world better with Alien in it? And I feel similarly, like, my go-to answer for this is Kubrick's Napoleon. I would have loved to have seen that movie, but if I had seen that movie, we wouldn't have Barry Lyndon. And I don't think I want to live in a world without Barry Lyndon. I know you have a distaste towards 80s nostalgia and reverence towards 80s US cinema, but admittedly, isn't the new Hollywood era just as overtly mythologized and romanticized, and put on a pedestal? It had cracks and flaws like any other era. So I should probably give a little bit of elaboration. I don't think I've made this point too much on YouTube. It's more something in my Letterboxd reviews or on the Cinema in Seconds podcast. Yeah, I tend to have a lot of suspicion about classic 80s movies. Not that there aren't many classic films from that decade, but a specific kind of pop culture blockbuster that is often mythologized as like the great 80s movies I find kind of grating. There are a couple of exceptions, Back to the Future being a big one, a movie that genuinely is that good and is also, quintessentially 80s. But yeah, it's an era I tend to hold with a lot less enthusiasm than others, especially in regards to Hollywood cinema specifically. As to your point, yeah, absolutely. The new Hollywood is prone to mythology. It had flaws, it had cracks, it had things that you could criticize about and should criticize about. But it is also an era of movies that just appeals to me a lot more. I think if you were to take a slate of classic 70s American movies and pit it against a slate of classic 80s American movies, the 70s movies would mop the floor with the 80s movies 9 times out of 10. There are exceptions, sure, but by and large, it is a collection of films that appeals to me much, much more, and an ethos of filmmaking that resonates with me more. I like the morally ambiguous, sort of character-driven, murky, violent, despairing stories of 70s cinema, to kind of generalize, versus the clean-cut slickness and likability of 80s movies. Though again, these are generalizations, your overall point is not incorrect. What are the trademarks of Canadian cinema? I couldn't tell you. I'm a Canadian. I love cinema. I do not watch a lot of Canadian cinema. I do think it's interesting that two of our most well-regarded auteurs, David Cronenberg and Adam Agoyan, seem pretty preoccupied with deviant, perverted sex stuff in their movies. I think that's neat, but maybe it's just because it goes against the image of Canada as a kind of quaint and wholesome place. What is the best low-key final film from a director? I think Family Plot is definitely very fitting. So I'm thinking this means, final films that aren't Eyes Wide Shut, that aren't like the great triumphant final word on cinema. And the one that comes to mind immediately for me is Seven Women, directed by John Ford, because it's not necessarily a major achievement, and it doesn't feel like I would not call it anywhere near one of his best movies, but it is very good. It's very well made. It has great performances, especially Anne Bancroft, and it's both interesting to watch and see why Ford would have been kind of passé by then, because it's the mid-60s when he makes this, and it feels very old-fashioned Hollywood in so many ways, and especially in its formalism. And in an era where Hollywood cinema is undergoing a pretty radical transformation in its style and attitudes, yeah, I can see why audiences would look at something like Seven Women and be like, this feels like yesterday's news. But it is a very accomplished movie, and it does show that even at the end of his career, Ford was still capable of doing really good work. And it's interesting because for a filmmaker who so often was preoccupied with men, his final movie would center so much on women, and strong women in particular. What are your thoughts on Danny Boyle? I like him. He's not my favorite director. I think he can be pretty inconsistent, in part, though, because he takes really bold, wild swings, and that's a very admirable trait. And his movies can often be stylistically invigorating, even when the overall film is maybe lesser than. Usually you can count on Boyle to bring in at least a couple of interesting flourishes and quirks. My question is a bit silly. Would you rather see a sci-fi movie directed by Martin Scorsese or a Western directed by David Fincher? I think the sci-fi movie by Scorsese makes more sense. Westerns as a genre is not just a sort of narrative. It's a very, not strict aesthetic, but a very defined aesthetic, a defined time period. And I think a lot of that bristles against Fincher's own natural sensibilities. And while it might be fun to see him explore that, I don't think it would necessarily be the most conducive to actually a good movie. Whereas science fiction, while there are sort of a lot of hallmarks to it in its aesthetics and its trappings, is actually a very broadly defined genre that can look like a lot of different things. And I just think that would probably give Scorsese more freedom to, make something out of that genre of high quality. That having been said, maybe we get both. Wouldn't that be nice? If all your favorite directors were premiering a movie the same day, which would you go to see first? Who do you think is the greatest living film director? So I'm putting these together because my answer to both is the same, and it is Scorsese. And I apologize if that's kind of a boring answer because, of course it's Scorsese, but beyond the legacy he has as a filmmaker, he's not a legacy artist. He's still doing really vibrant, essential work and still pushing himself in new ways. And I say that as someone who probably liked Killers of the Flower Moon maybe 10 or 15% less than most people did. Still a great movie, still an ambitious movie, still asking interesting, difficult questions, has one of the greatest endings of any film in Scorsese's entire career. And The Irishman, I think, is one of Scorsese's greatest movies ever, full stop. And I think time will vindicate that. I think we will talk about that movie with the same regard that we do Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and Goodfellas. It is that level of achievement. Also, Scorsese only has so many movies left, and in terms of who are you going to see first, I cherish every Scorsese movie that we have left, and the release of them is very special. We'll probably only have maybe 3 or 4, if we're lucky, to look forward to in the future. So, yeah, I mean, it has to be Scorsese. In your opinion, which filmmaker from any point in film history who did not make one in real life do you think would make or would have made the best Dracula adaptation? My mind goes to Greg Araki, which is kind of a hot take because I'm not super well versed in his filmography, but I just think he would get the sexuality of the character, the violence and horror of the story, and also the sort of queer subtext is something he could pull out really effectively. And he just seems like someone who has a different, interesting, unique aesthetic that he wouldn't do what you would expect a Dracula movie to look like, which I think is what you need for a story that's that familiar. Do you prefer directors wanting to make different genres of film, or directors that keep making the same type of movies but still have a good filmography? Both are good as long as the movies are good themselves. I get frustrated with people like John Carney, who has essentially made a career out of making the same kind of movie, in part because I think that movie is by and large getting worse, or at least losing its luster. But you look at someone like Ozu, who made very similar movies thematically, not even just thematically, like narratively, in terms of basic storylines, character arcs, conflicts, over and over and over again throughout his career. But those movies are so rich and vibrant, and so, they're finding new things to explore and new conclusions to draw, even while exploring a similar template. So as long as the movies themselves, they're offering some freshness in their approach, be it aesthetic, narrative, theme, whatever, I think either approach is just as valuable as the other. What would be the perfect final Spielberg, Scorsese, and Coen brothers film? What's interesting is Spielberg and Scorsese's last few movies feel like they could be a final film and be a perfect capper to the career. The Irishman would have been a perfect final film for Scorsese. In a way, though, so would Killers of the Flower Moon, especially with how it ends. The Fabelmans, Spielberg being, going his whole career making movies in some subtextual way about his parents' divorce, ending his career with a movie explicitly about that, would have been a great swan song. But then Disclosure Day arrives, and it's kind of a spiritual sequel to The Fabelmans in some really interesting ways, and it also returns Spielberg to the alien invasion movie, a genre that he may have perfected better than any other filmmaker. So that also could have been a perfect final film, or could be a perfect final film if he chooses not to make another film. But I think what that also reveals is the idea of the perfect final film is kind of an illusion, and it's fun to think about and talk about and speculate, and it does fill me with some joy that Stanley Kubrick's final film, say Eyes Wide Shut, is a genuine masterpiece and he goes out on a real triumph. But on the other hand, I also think that the low-key final films are just as valuable, or maybe not just as valuable, but are worthy in their own right. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance would have been the perfect final John Ford film. It's a Western. He's teaming again with John Wayne and with Jimmy Stewart, two of his major collaborators. It is an impeccable film that is very much one of his all-time esteemed classics, and it concludes with,
"When the legend becomes fact, print the legend."
What better summation of Ford's career, and especially his career making Westerns, could you want? And yet, if that was his last film, we lose Cheyenne Autumn. An imperfect movie, but an even more explicit a film that reckons with the genocidal nature of the Western and America's past, more so than Ford had prior. We don't get Seven Women, this interesting curiosity at the end of his career that showed he could still explore new aspects of the world through his cinema, and was still a very capable, fundamental craftsman of Hollywood filmmaking and narrative filmmaking. Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is maybe the more poetic final film, but I wouldn't want that poetry to come at the expense of these other films that are not as good as Valance, but are still interesting and are still providing new insights into his mind, his worldview, his artistry. And I feel that way about Scorsese and Spielberg. Even if they each make one more film and it's kind of mediocre and not as good, and we say, oh, wouldn't it have been great if they could have ended with, Fabelmans or with The Irishman or Killers of the Flower Moon, I still think that would be worth it because I would like just more from them, even imperfect. In your top 100, you had a Miyazaki but not a Takahata film. So what's your favorite of his? Grave of the Fireflies, pretty much unquestionably. It was in contention for the top 100 and just didn't make the final cut. I also love The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. Only Yesterday is really good. My Neighbor the Yamadas is very funny and one of the more adventurous in terms of art style from him, but also from Studio Ghibli generally. Much as I love Ghibli, their general aesthetic could be described as very much following a similar mold. And Takahata stands out as someone who was way more willing to experiment with his basic art style, and I really appreciate that. You can bring back one filmmaker who has passed to make another film set in current times. Who do you think would have the most to say? This framing is interesting, because usually the question of, if you could have any filmmaker come back to make one more movie, who would you pick? Kubrick, unquestionably. I'd give anything for one more Kubrick. But because the framing here is more about who would have the most to comment on about the world today, I think I have to go with Robert Altman. both because of the political satire in a movie like Nashville. I think the mind that brought us that would have a lot to say about the America of the 2010s and 2020s, but also the Hollywood satire in The Player. You know, there's a reason why when I made a video about AI art, I structured it kind of around The Player as my case study, because even though the film is 30 years old and is not about AI really, at its core, it's addressing a lot of the concerns and a lot of the kind of the evils and threat that AI represents in this different context. And I think Altman making a movie directly addressing that with that same insight and sort of scathing critical mind, I think could be very interesting.
We want the films of the new John Hustons, Orson Welles.
Since Mount Rushmore listing ranking has become a big thing, I'd love to hear who would be on your Mount Rushmore of modern film directors. Okay, so because you specified modern directors, I think we'll set some parameters for what constitutes a modern director. And for this question, I'm going to take it to mean directors whose debut feature was released in the 21st century. I think that gives us a good range and a good sort of clear time frame. We need 4 names. 1, Robert Eggers, for me, locked in. He's made 4 films. I've loved all 4. To varying degrees, I don't think they're all equal, but I wouldn't say any of them are less than great. His consistency as a filmmaker is, especially in Hollywood, I think is kind of unmatched of his generation. 2, Barry Jenkins. The 1-2 punch of Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk. Just, I can't escape the feeling of what a clear announcement and then solidification of a great new talent in our midst those films felt like when they released. Admittedly, my faith has been shaken somewhat by Mufasa, which does cloud things a bit for Jenkins, but I am also hopeful that that was ultimately a studio monstrosity, and with that out of his system, having made one for them, as it were, he can get back to making intimate, beautiful movies like he broke through with Moonlight and Beale Street. So fingers crossed there. Please, Barry. 3, Christian Mungio, who is a director I think is easy to take for granted, in part because he works somewhat sporadically, and in part because outside of 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, I don't think his films have ever really received the kind of rapturous praise or high-profile releases that they really should have. I've actually never seen one of this guy's movies in theaters. I don't know how many of them ever even got releases near me, or if they did, if they lasted more than a week. But masterful direction, and specifically his ability to make films that really slowly creep up on you until they have you like completely absorbed and at their mercy. People will often use the expression, it grabs you by the throat, to talk about a film that is really exciting and really engaging. And Mungio's films don't really do that. They don't grab you by the throat so much as they slowly wrap themselves around and exert ever so slightly more pressure until you eventually realize, oh, I'm in a chokehold. I am so desperately tense and uncomfortable and invested in what I'm watching. And for my last pick, I'm going to maybe take a bit of a risk. I'm going to go with Jane Schoenbrunn, who is someone that, yes, this is very much on the strength of just one movie, but my God, what a movie. I Saw the TV Glow is, I think, very much a singular achievement that I'm hard-pressed to even compare to too many other films. It was such a unique and special thing, which maybe gives some pause of how can they possibly follow up this movie. But on the other hand, I think what Schoenbrunn really has, especially when we're talking about modern directors, is a unique modern experience. Someone who, like me and like a lot of people I think that are among my viewers in my age range, grew up in an analog media world and got to watch it transition into a digital media world. And Schoenbrunn's films capture that feeling and that energy and that history in a really hard to define but also very powerful way that I think it will set them apart from their peers and make them a quintessential director of this era. And also, Camp Miasma looks awesome. If it's even half as good as it looks, then I think Schoenbrunn is very much established as a Mount Rushmore caliber filmmaker. Who's a director you feel is underrated or deserving of more praise? So I'm going to choose a director who not is overrated in the general culture, but who I think I underrated for a long time, and that's William Wyler. Because on the one hand, how can this guy be underrated? He's literally been nominated for the Best Director Oscar more than anyone else in history, still to this day. And yeah, that is true, but as a teenager and young man first getting into classic film, that also made it very easy to kind of disrespect him, to see him as this old fuddy-duddy amidst the classic Hollywood directors, especially because he was a much less enticing sell to a young man. Hitchcock is cool. He makes thrillers and movies that are, obsessed with sex and murder. John Huston is cool. He makes gritty crime movies and dark explorations of the human spirit. John Ford is cool. He makes westerns. William Wyler is not cool. He makes prestige dramas that the Academy likes and that the American Film Institute likes. These are movies for grandpa. And it's only with time that I've revisited some of his films like The Best Years of Our Lives and been like, oh no, this is actually really great and really moving and really well made. And just because Wyler doesn't have as big a personality as a Hitchcock or a Hawks, that doesn't mean he's a lesser than filmmaker or that he's not very skilled at what he's doing. I would see movies like The Big Country last year, which was one of my favorite film discoveries from last year and one of my favorite westerns of that period at all. And there's a whole bunch of his films now that I look back on that I saw when I was younger, was kind of dismissive of, thought were fine enough, but didn't really give them much thought, that I think, I bet I'm going to go back and rewatch that and say, oh, that's actually really great and really well made. Who's your favorite director who you haven't talked about much in your videos? Terrence Malick comes to mind. He's made so many films that I love, including films that are among my very, very favorites, but he's hard to talk about in a video essay sphere because so much of what makes his films special is the visual poetry of them, and I don't know if I have anything to say about them in a kind of intellectual or analytic sense because so much of it is about feeling and feeling the images that I don't really want to drone over them in my voiceover. Your top 100 movies list had just one film directed by women, The Matrix by the Wachowski sisters. In your other essays, you don't usually comment on movies directed by women as well. Do you think you have a blind spot for women directors? I think that's a fair criticism. I think you could more precisely say I don't have an expertise in women directors. I've seen actually a fair amount of films directed by women, and I've certainly made it more of a point since graduating from undergrad years to see more movies directed by women, but it is not an area that I feel I have as thorough a knowledge of, that in the context of making video essays about, I would feel presumptuous or maybe even out of my depth presenting myself as a kind of authority on these movies. It's something that actually came up researching the AFI video and is quoted in the AFI video, and I can't remember the exact quote or who said it, but it might sound obvious to say, but the only reason films become canonized, or the only way rather that films become canonized classics, is that they are seen over and over and over again, and how few directed by women films have that luxury. Beyond all the other obstacles that women filmmakers have faced historically in Hollywood and elsewhere in the world, how many of those films are not just seen, but seen frequently? And it's something that I, can refer to in my own making of videos, even though I have seen, my share of Agnes Varda films or, Catherine Bigelow movies or Celine Sciamma films. I've only seen most of these once, and I don't really feel like I'm in a position to really come out and say, here's, my take on these movies. I don't feel like I've earned that yet. And it also, in terms of like the canonization stuff, when I made my top 100 list, one of the films that I had in contention was Varda's Vagabond, which I'd seen some years prior and thought was brilliant. This kind of grungy take on the Citizen Kane story of a person's life after their death told from different vantage points. But instead of having the opulent, grand Hollywood vision of Citizen Kane, it's told in this lower budget, grimy, grungy aesthetic, and it's telling the story not of this great important figure in history and politics, but of someone who is not terribly significant to the overall sort of arc of history, and using that approach for that kind of story instead. I thought it was a brilliant movie, definitely my favorite Varda, but I'd seen it once. And it's hard to compete against movies that I've seen multiple times, in some cases movies I've seen for most of my life, and not just in context of putting in a list, but especially putting in a top 100 video. I wasn't just putting a list of like, here's my favorite movies. I also have to talk about them and say something meaningful about them. So I felt like, yeah, Vagabond probably would be in contention for, and should be in contention for this list, but realistically, can I present it as one of my favorite movies and also say something meaningful about it after just one viewing several years ago? Probably not. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, though, yeah, I think it is fair to say that it's either a blind spot or just an area that I'm not an expert in. 100%. How do you feel about the implications of auteur theory when considering the outlying mediums of non-commercial cinema, i.e. experimental cinema, or short films, even works that were educational films or films for the state? Oh boy, this could be like a video essay unto itself that could go on for like an hour talking about auteur theory when applied outside of the original kind of paradigm it was designed for. Because yeah, when the auteurists were developing these ideas, they were specifically developing it to talk about commercial narrative cinema. And especially with the Hollywood auteurs, it was about how one establishes a kind of artistry and personal vision while working within the studio machinery of the industrial system by which films were made in Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So in some ways, it's not a perfect framework for applying to these other formats of cinema. That being said, when you look at the core of a lot of auteur theory, or even precursor works to auteur theory, like Alexandre Astruc's, the camera stilo, the camera as pen, the real fundamental thing is less that broader industry infrastructure than it is the nature of the medium, using moving images to communicate, and to express personal vision and artistry through framing, blocking, composition, camera angles, lenses, like the medium of cinema as means of expression, not just filming plays or filming words, but the camera itself, they are the words, they are the language that is used. And in that sense, those fundamentals are just as applicable to the works that you cite as they are to narrative cinema. So it doesn't necessarily fit cleanly, but I don't think that those works are disqualified from auteur consideration because of that fundamental similarity. What I do think is interesting, though, another format to consider is the work of television directors, because this is also an area where auteur theory gets muddy, because at least when applied outside of its original context, because just the role that a TV director fits is usually pretty far removed from that of a director on a film. And in some ways, like, the showrunners become the auteurs of TV more so than the directors themselves. But that, I think, would also, you get into tangential arguments then about, well, if the directors, though, are the ones who are nuts and bolts putting the visual language of the show together, should they have more credit than they do? And I don't know. I'm ultimately not, frankly, versed in enough television to really make too strong an argument in that point. But in terms of your question of how this theory works when applied outside of sort of narrative cinema, I think beyond experimental films, beyond industrial films and films for the state, television is actually where you see even more friction and even more instability in these categories translated to a different format. What is an example of a movie with a non-linear story that would have been better with a linear one, and vice versa? I don't really have an answer for the vice versa, but as far as a movie that I think would have been better with just a straightforwardly linear presentation, Project Hail Mary comes to mind. Liked the movie a lot, and I can see what it's going for with its flashback structure, but I did find watching it that at some points it was kind of impeding on the film's momentum, and specifically there's kind of a big revelation late in the film that on the one level is actually quite a big deal for the narrative, but also is positioned in such a way that I don't think it is as meaningful as it should be, in part because ultimately the non-linear structure is kind of more of a hindrance than it is a help. It's a minor thing, still a good movie. I don't think it ruins it by any stretch. I'm not even fully convinced a linear telling would be inherently superior, but that's one example that stands out where the non-linear storytelling was not, to my eyes, fully thought through or fully executed with complete success. What's your opinion on video game movie adaptations? I know you're a big fan of From Software games, so what are your thoughts on the upcoming Elden Ring film adaptation? Are you excited or skeptical? And how do you think a game like that could translate successfully into a movie? Lumping these together, because broadly asking about video game adaptations, I've never seen a particularly great one. I've seen some movies I like that are based on video games, but they have yet to have their Superman the movie, I think. Some people might argue The Last of Us TV show, I've not seen. I would also argue that's television, different ball game, and I can see TV being a format that is more advantageous to video game adaptations than movies are. As far as Elden Ring goes, I would describe my emotion towards it as intrigued. I'm not necessarily hyped. in part just because of, I don't know, I don't really get hyped for movies in that way that I used to, just I think because of age. But also, I don't know, like it seems like it's being made with the right reasons in terms of the interests of the creators, and the sort of impetus behind its making seem like it's driven more by a creativity and a curiosity and interest in the material rather than in a kind of cynical exploitation of an IP. From Software have also been, for the most part, pretty good about treating their own properties with a kind of dignity and not crassly bringing them out for dollars. So I'm hopeful that if they're signing off on this film adaptation, it's because they see real artistic merit in it. And I am especially curious because of just the simple question of, like, how do you do this? From Software's game design is so tailored to the nature of video games that on the one level that makes them not ideal objects for films, but on another level more fascinating, because you do actually have to do a lot in adaptation to translate it to this different medium, and that opens up a lot of exciting possibilities. One of the reasons an Uncharted movie was never interesting to me is because those games are already so cinematic, they border on being movies that you can play. So a movie version is just going to be a movie that you can't play, and that's just a movie. Now, as it happens, the Uncharted movie just flatly sucked, so that barely mattered, but that was very much something going into it, and when the film was announced, that I was thinking. It's part of why The Last of Us show doesn't really interest me that much, because I feel like I've seen it in an avenue where I also got to interact with it. On the flip side, you have adaptations like the recent Mario movies, which are just kind of pandering to a nostalgia that you can't really do for Elden Ring, just for no other reason that it's not old enough to have nostalgia for yet. You can pander to its audience by, giving them sort of recognition of the gaming elements that they enjoy, but it doesn't open itself up to that kind of adaptation, and its tone would also not really allow for that in a way that Mario, which can function as like children's media, can. So I'm very intrigued. What's your take on rewatching films in general? Is it even a good idea? Aren't some movies ruined by revisiting them? Any films you want to revisit after all these years? What are some films you're afraid to rewatch? Lumping all these together because they're different aspects of the same question, I love rewatching movies. I think it's vital and good, whether for reasons of just aesthetic enjoyment and pleasure, or for reassessing and reanalyzing certain films that you can't grasp everything on a first viewing or even a third or fourth viewing, and going to them becomes more meaningful with time. And sometimes films do go up, sometimes films also go down. That's okay too. Just because a film loses something on a rewatch, that doesn't invalidate what the original watch was for you. So I think that's okay. Film I'm eager to rewatch, Stalker, because the one time I saw it was very early in the development of the Criterion Channel. It was before it was even available as a service, and they were doing this kind of trial period for however many weeks, where every week there was one film you could watch, and one of the weeks was Stalker, and I was really excited, and I was trying to watch it, but was early in the software, and it was also when I had pretty bad internet, so every 2, 3, 4 minutes, the movie was stopping and buffering, and I had that little loading icon in the corner of the screen, and I really should have just said this isn't working and pulled the plug and called it a day, but I stubbornly was like, no, I want to watch this movie, and I am enjoying it. But by the halfway point, I was not even processing it as a story. It was a series of images that looked nice, and I could kind of somewhat grasp it on a thematic level and sort of try and think about what the film was saying. But on another level, it was just such a disconnected viewing experience that I almost feel like I haven't even seen the movie. That's when I really need to revisit, because especially like of all the movies to have that experience with, Stalker was probably one of the worst ones. A movie I'm afraid to rewatch, Sin City, because I loved it when I was a teenager, and oh boy, it seems like the kind of movie that is mostly loved by teenagers. And it doesn't help that another movie I loved around that same era, V for Vendetta, I rewatched that a couple years ago, and I didn't hate it, certainly. I didn't even dislike it, but it's not great. It's pretty flawed, and there is a part of me that's like, oh, am I going to tear down all my adolescent comic book entertainments that seemed so edgy and cool when I was 14? Now, the one thing Sin City has going for it is that even as a teenager, I knew it was, a silly, juvenile, adolescent movie that was just had a cool style, whereas V for Vendetta is something that was aspiring to a kind of political, critical film, and something that I thought was like very weighty and intelligent. So that will probably help it, but I am very weary of revisiting it. You've mentioned before that you consider Denzel Washington in Malcolm X one of the great film performances, and Clarice Starling and Hannibal Lecter as two of the great film characters. What are some other performances/characters that would qualify for this all-time greats tier in your opinion? What are some of your favorite actors? So these are questions I'm clearly grouping together because they're more or less asking the same thing. I generally respond really strongly in movies to characters and performance, so if you wanted to get a good sense of who my favorite actors and film characters were, my top 100 would basically be Exhibit A. But I also think that's kind of a cop-out, so I will give a specific answer. Kim Novak as Madeline/Judy in Vertigo, I think is an amazing character and a phenomenal performance that doesn't really get its flowers, which is kind of insane because it is central to a film that is often considered maybe the greatest of all time. But so much of that is focused on Hitchcock and Hitchcock's masterful direction. If actors are celebrated, it's Jimmy Stewart pushing his movie star persona to its darkest and most self-critical extremes, most despairing and hopeless extremes. And Novak, the narrative is very famously known now that Hitchcock didn't want Novak. He wanted Vera Miles. And she got pregnant, couldn't do the movie. He was saddled with an actress that he didn't want. And there's this kind of meta quality that he is shaping someone into his idealized version in his head because he doesn't actually have that idealized version, just like Stewart's character is, just like Scotty is in Vertigo. And in that, I think Novak kind of gets lost in the shuffle, and it probably doesn't help that outside of Vertigo, Novak's performances are a little uneven and inconsistent, but man, that Vertigo work is truly extraordinary. There is a moment, the famous scene where she emerges from the bathroom and there's that green light. Beautiful, haunting, deeply unsettling and upsetting scene. But what really solidifies how upsetting it is for me is Novak has just this moment where her face quivers in such a way as to say, please let this finally be enough, that I will make this man happy and he will stop tormenting me and putting me through what he's putting me through. And it breaks my heart every time. Novak in Vertigo, so good. And if I were to highlight two just actors I really like who really got honestly shortchanged in my top 100, I do want to say two names. Bette Davis, who had a couple films that were in contention for the top 100, namely All About Eve and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, but she's always great, truly fearless, stands out so much in the era of stardom she comes from because of how just totally willing to do anything she was. Glamour is such an integral part of the classic Hollywood movie star, and Davis could do glamour and do it very well, but she also didn't need it and was very willing to abandon it for a role or movie when it was the right choice. Incredible. And then a more recent actor, Benicio del Toro. I just like seeing him on screen. He just has a lovely presence, and one of the great treats of 2025 was what a stellar year he had between One Battle After Another and the underrated but destined to be eventually recognized as a major achievement, The Phoenician Scheme. Has there ever been a romance that a movie legit tried to sell you that straight up didn't work? My recent example would be James Bond and Madeline Swan in Spectre, and especially, really, primarily, No Time to Die. As two hot people who want to hook up, great, no qualms there. As the great love of James Bond's life, absolutely not. This character is a bore. Léa Seydoux is a great actor, but she gets nothing to do in these movies and has very little chemistry with Craig, especially in the movie that's really insisting on this being a romance for the ages, and it torpedoes so much of what that movie is trying to do. Are there any movies you want to like but don't that you would consider remaking were you given the chance, i.e. a mediocre Bond film? I mean, I wouldn't remake them because I'm not a filmmaker, so no matter how bad the movie was, it would turn out much worse in my hands. But as far as movies I don't like that I would like to see remade, I generally feel like artistically remakes would be better served taking films that had good ideas and potential but dropped the ball and doing them better. And since you brought up Bond in specific, I'll say The Man with the Golden Gun. It's an awesome premise for a Bond movie going up against the ultimate kind of assassin. A golden gun is a great theatrical, comic booky device to give it a almost extra level of pop flair. And the fact that they got Christopher Lee to play the bad guy in the movie is icing on the cake, but that movie is terrible, cheap, ugly-looking, mean-spirited, unexciting, boring. It's such a blunder. It's one of the worst films of the series, and that's a shame. I also have a friend who's read the short story, The Man with the Golden Gun, which he describes as actually a pretty interesting little Bond story. You couldn't really do it from discussions with him as like a feature film without changing a lot, but there's a kernel of an idea there, I think, that they should just repurpose. You can't call it The Man with the Golden Gun, but I think the DNA of it is general enough that you can make something better with those ingredients. Did you see The Odyssey? Would love your thoughts. Now that The Odyssey has come out, what is the best Nolan film? Which actors would you like to see Nolan work with? Which should he reteam with and promote to lead like he did with Murphy and Damon? If you had to recast The Odyssey with any actor between the 1950s and 80s, who would you pick? A lot of questions about The Odyssey. Makes sense. Big release of the summer. I liked it a lot. I really liked it, in fact. It's one of my favorite films of the year so far. You can read a more full review on Letterboxd that goes into more full thoughts. In terms of Nolan's overall body of work, I would say it's closer to the middle of the pack, but that speaks more highly to how consistent I think he's been. Favorite Nolan movie? My heart still says Inception. Oppenheimer is nipping at those heels, though, and I think probably will surpass it with time. In terms of who I would like to see Nolan elevate from his supporting cast to being one of his leads, I'll go with my two favorite supporting performances in The Odyssey, Pattinson and Anne Hathaway. Also, long shot pick, Samantha Morton. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but it'd be great. She's really good in The Odyssey. And then as far as the question of like a recasting, I don't have a good answer, but in this movie coming out and kind of reading about some of the other cinematic adaptations of The Odyssey and of Homer, coming across, there's this 50s movie called Ulysses with Kirk Douglas as Ulysses. It's like, I have no idea how that is, if it's any good or not, but I'm kind of intrigued by it, so I guess that'll be kind of my roundabout answer to your question. In your experience, where do you find audiences to be the least flexible on meeting films on their own terms? For example, if a film uses dream logic, but people want a more logical structure. I think any kind of big emotion sincerity leads people to bristle. I remember seeing The Abyss in a theatrical screening and being completely swept up in it and loving it, but also hearing people in the audience snicker at some of its more open sort of pleas for peace and sharing the world, and some of even the cornier lines about, the turning to the one soldier and being like, looks like you guys are out of a job, and, snickering at how quaint and naive it seemed. And that actually really made me quite sad, that a movie about how, aspiring to the hope that we could all live on this planet harmoniously and as one and share in this paradise that we exist upon is seen as like nonsense and drivel. That's kind of sad. But I'd also say that like even those of us who say this, who say like we want that sincerity, we don't want films that are drowning in their too cool for school cynicism, we want these open-hearted big emotional swings. A lot of us will say that, but then when we see something that is earnest and emotional and vulnerable, if it bristles with our specific sensibilities, it's open to mockery. Look at the reaction to The Whale, which is, I understand some of the criticisms people have of that movie, but there was especially a lot of mockery of its more earnest kind of sentimental moments as being just open season for yucks and jokes, and even like a lot of that film's status as like meme image fodder. I'm not saying this is inherently a bad thing or that I'm above this, but it does strike me as indicative of how, yes, even those of us who say we want sincerity and we don't want our films to be so irony poisoned, will often actually resist when we get one that's doing it if it doesn't hit us emotionally in a way that we connect with. Besides James Bond, do you have any favorite movie franchises? So on one level, this question is obviously yes. There's lots of film series that I've watched through all of and have rewatched many times and have fond memories of and love as much as anyone else. So clearly, but on the other hand, thinking about this in terms of like fandom and anticipation and excitement and being can't wait for the next one, I do feel somewhat disconnected from that now. Not to say that I'm not interested flatly. Like, I'll be honest, I don't think I'll ever skip a Batman movie in theaters, probably ever. And certainly, like, the big franchise movies, I tend to go see them for the most part. But as far as, like, hype and being just passionate and devouring every piece of news and, just defining oneself as, like, I'm a fan of this thing, I do feel like that's kind of a young person's game and a game that I'm pretty disconnected with. A lot of the time, I don't even watch trailers anymore unless I see them at the theater. And I don't think that that necessarily is like a conscious choice. For all my criticisms of fandom cultures, it's not that I feel like I'm above that now, or I'm too mature and I can't be sullied with these things, so much as just I don't have the space for it in my life that I did when I was younger. Would you ever do a video on the Star Trek TOS movies? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on them, specifically 2 and 6. No plans at the moment, but I mostly really like to love the original series movies, especially 2 and 6. And also 4. Those are all great. Honestly, the only one I dislike is, of course, infamously, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier.
I know this ship like the back of my hand.
I know you love McCabe's coat from McCabe and Mrs. Miller. Any other favorite film fashion items? There is one other fashion icon in my life, one fashion that I aspire to, but it is not from the movies. It's from pro wrestling. What is the greatest unexpected double feature of all time? 2 films that don't have anything in common narratively, but thematically are very similar. So I created one of these by accident one day. It was the night of the 2021 election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and I did not want to be doom scrolling the entire night, so I thought I'm just going to do a double feature, and my framework was 2 movies that are really long and are also really sort of absorbing and compelling and will have me just locked in and not looking at my phone at all or not tempted to look at my phone. So I chose Apocalypse Now and Zodiac. Very different movies made in completely different eras, completely different aesthetic sensibilities, but watching them together, they did kind of form this portrait of a national madness in the American psyche of the late 60s and into the 70s that was actually pretty fascinating to see, behold, and probably very unfortunate to watch the night of a US presidential election that had me feeling very stressed and upsetting. But at the same time, the movies work together really great, so that part was nice. Rank the performances in Magnolia from worst to best, pretty please. There's like 400 people in that movie, so I don't think I can do all of them, but I will give you a top 3 best performances. Number 1, Tom Cruise. Number 2, Melora Walters. Number 3, Philip Seymour Hoffman. What is your favorite novel to film adaptation? Not my absolute favorite, but I recently read for the first time The Silence of the Lambs, and man, is that an example of an adaptation that took a very good book and honed everything that was good about it to perfection. Because don't get me wrong, the book is very good, even great. It is a compulsively readable page-turner. Thomas Harris could write serial killer fiction to incredibly compelling and chilling effect. The movie is one of the greatest movies ever made. If you were forced to stop watching one movie genre, what would you pick? I'm going to go really niche and specific subgenre here with inspiring teacher who uplifts troubled student youth. I hate that shit. What is your ranking of all live-action Batman movies? Again, there's like 400, so I'm not going to do them all, but I will say my favorite is definitely Batman Returns. And my least favorite, the cliche choice is Batman and Robin, but as I think on it, I think it is Batman v Superman. That movie was just a miserable, miserable experience. And while I thought a rewatch might smooth over my issues, or at the very least, I'd feel a little bit calmer about the whole thing, it actually made me feel worse. Just an awful time. Do you think there is value to be found in bad movies? If so, what? Absolutely. I mean, if for no other reason than you can't appreciate the peaks without the valleys. Bad movies give you context for what constitutes a good movie by being the opposite. I also think, though, that you learn a lot from watching bad movies, whether from the perspective of an aspiring filmmaker or from a critical perspective. Understanding why something doesn't work on film helps you as a filmmaker be better to avoid those mistakes. As any kind of critic watching a bad movie, having to articulate why you think something is bad makes you a better writer. It makes you a better film watcher. It makes you more insightful in your ability to read films and unpack them and then explain them in your own words. Also, bad movies can be really funny, and it's nice to laugh. How far apart do you think movies and TV actually are as art forms, and how difficult do you think it is to translate one to the other? By which I mean, should a film based on a show feel more like the show or more like a movie? Ooh, another question that could be like a video in its own right. I will say, fundamentally, they're very similar art forms in the formalism of them. They're engaging with the same basic tools. The main differences are in terms of formatting and structure. episode length and seasons versus single solitary film experiences and movie, sort of the standard feature length runtimes we're familiar with. But I also think the other main difference is more how the audience engages with the mediums and the infrastructures behind that. And obviously that gets blurred in an era of at-home film viewing, and there's been a gradual collapsing of the distinctions between film and television, and people have argued that there should be. I'm not one of those people. I do think they are on some core level distinct experiences, not in a way that one is superior to the other, but more that just the way we engage with TV is suitably different than from the way that we engage with film, that I don't think they can be discussed interchangeably. As far as your question, though, about movies that are spun off from TV shows, I think there's two broad styles that those kinds of adaptations can fall into. You can either have movies based on shows that feel just like a big episode of the show, or movies that really kind of are reworking the material for film and feel pretty different from the show they're coming from. And I think both are honestly valid. Sometimes it's really gratifying and fun to see that TV show you like done in the big sort of momentous style of a movie, even if it's fundamentally not that far removed from the show. Your Batman Mask of the Phantasms. On the other hand, I do think that the movies that have been spun off from TV shows that have been the best overall achievements are the ones that take the big risks and changes. And specifically, I'm thinking of the best movie made out of a TV show of all time, in my opinion, Twin Peaks: Fire Walk with Me, which is visually distinct from the show it's based on. It's tonally distinct from the show. It is much darker and is not that the show didn't have its dark elements, but there's none of the comedy or very little of the comedy in the film to counteract the just bleak portrait of abuse and violence and horror to this world. And it's shocking to watch, and even just the nature of doing a prequel to this series that was left on this cliffhanger and like, what's going to happen next? And instead using the movie as an excuse to re-examine, well, what happened from the start, and make you rethink about how you've engaged with the show and what you've enjoyed about it, and even question your own sort of position, taking a kind of light pleasure in this quirky mystery story that the key moment of the story that launches everything into motion is the abuse and murder of a teenage girl, and makes you kind of feel awful for engaging in that. And it's not surprising that the film was hated and booed when it was first shown at Cannes in 1992, but now I think we watch as an essential component of Twin Peaks, that all of Twin Peaks, the series, is better because Fire Walk with Me exists. Not just because the movie is another good thing to put in the Twin Peaks file, but because it makes the show richer. It makes the show more of a tragedy. Any movies you feel like you were too old for, movies you feel like would have had a bigger personal impact if you had seen them earlier. My go-to answer is the films of Makoto Shinkai, specifically Your Name and Weathering with You, which are very good movies. Very well made, very pretty. They're just dazzling to look at. But they are also these anime that are engaging in these kind of teen melodramas that are burdened with a lot of teen angst and like big swelling emotions and kind of self-absorption that if I had seen when I was a little lovesick, angsty teenager, I think I would have been all over and would have connected to in a big way and found to be these profound emotional experiences. But watching as an adult, there is this part of me that's like, these kids need to get over themselves just a bit. Do you think Supergirl failed because James Gunn didn't hold Craig Gillespie's hand as the head of the studio? Couldn't tell you. Haven't seen it yet. With many films focusing on visuals over sound, are there examples you can think of where a film's sound design outshined its visuals? This is tricky because I find most of the films that have really amazing, remarkable sound design, that tends to be part of a remarkable formalism throughout, that the images are also amazing and well constructed. So while there's lots of films I can cite that have great sound, I don't know if I could always say, oh, and it outshined the visuals. David Lynch's movies have amazing sound. Would I say that they outshine his visuals? I don't know. The one example, though, that does come to mind, and it's an obvious one, but The Conversation, which is about an audio surveillance engineer, and I would also say that the movie's visual style is almost deliberately a little bit drab and kind of gritty and grungy and not unremarkable, because it is actually a very good-looking movie, too, and a very well-thought-out movie visually, but it understands that the sound is kind of the spectacle of it, or the intrigue of it, and that's where the more dazzling effects are felt. But I also don't know how much of that is just being informed by no, it's a movie that's about sound, and therefore I'm more positioned to look at that specifically or listen for that specifically. You are pretty prolific on Letterboxd. What is your take on the platform? It's fun. I love Letterboxd. I like having a platform to have my own thoughts up about movies in a less sort of, I guess, professional context. Not to say I don't work hard on my reviews or think about them critically. I definitely do, but I do treat it as a diary, and it's a bit lighter in what it's asking of me than like YouTube, where I'm thinking of this as like, okay, these need to be really kind of thorough and well researched and well articulated and spend a lot of time putting together as precisely and fully as possible. Letterboxd is more loose and more fun. And I like seeing my friends' reviews. I like seeing what other people are seeing and their thoughts and commenting back and forth. I like that you can find genuinely really good, rich, insightful film criticism, and you can also find just kind of silly and fun stuff too. I like Letterboxd a lot. As far as like social media platforms, it's by far my favorite. You could say, oh, YouTube. I don't really see YouTube as like social media. I know it technically is, but I see it as a platform for hosting work, my work, and works of others that I enjoy watching. I'm not here to socialize per se, but Letterboxd is closer to just pure social media, and I love it. It has its problems too, or I should maybe more specifically say it can encourage, there's some pitfalls that come with things like Letterboxd, but I'll get into that in the next question, I think. Orson Welles has an infamous clip warning young filmmakers to not soak yourself in film. What are your thoughts on this quote? Do you think there's any truth to the danger of watching too many films, especially as a creative? I think there's definitely a danger, and it's not so much the question of too many films, so much as it is a question of only films. Movies are great. Movies are one of the things that make life worth living, but the key thing there is one of the things. It's, I think, important to expose yourself to other kinds of art and to other hobbies. Reading books, listening to music. Also, though, like playing video games, watching TV, like I don't think it necessarily needs to be all highbrow, kind of bettering yourself pursuits. One of my favorite hobbies in the world is professional wrestling, after all. So it's not about a kind of highbrow ascendance so much as it is just fleshing out the world that you're engaging with. And that goes beyond just art. It's also just having other hobbies, other things you like to do, having conversations with other people, friends, family, lovers, whatever it is, even just like coworkers. You know, not to say there's like a right, like a correct balance to pursue of this. If you're not socializing X amount of hours of your week, you need to up that number. If you're watching X amount of films, you need to bump that down and fill it in with something else. I don't think you need to be so mechanical about it, but it can be very easy or tempting to just absorb movies. And it's especially so in an era of at-home viewing, where it's very easy to get access to all sorts of films online through streaming services, through Tubi, which is free, through piracy. You know, there's a world of film at your fingertips. And then sites like Letterboxd can encourage it, not only with the sort of community built around film, which I think is actually one of the best things about it, but in things like letting you log your films, offering up your personal statistics, which, don't get me wrong, I love looking at my stats. It's a blast. I love logging movies. But it also becomes an activity and is structured in such a way that it can risk overtaking the movies themselves. And it's something I thought about a lot recently because I watched this documentary from the early 2000s called Cinemania. And it's chronicling a handful of hardcore cinephiles in New York who spend all their time going to the rep theaters and watching movies. Multiple films a day, every day, 7 days a week. None of them have jobs. They're all living on disability or social benefits program or insurance payout. None of them are having any other seeming hobbies or interests. They don't have friend circles outside of just the people they see at the cinema. It is just watching movies. And I found it to be a really sobering film-going experience. Not in the way of looking at a kind of gawking spectacle of like, my God, what a level of film consumption that's unhealthy. I don't think it's about the number, so much as the compulsion to just watch movies constantly and do nothing else. Seeing that, you start to reflect on one's own film going, and it's like, well, why do I do this? Am I watching movies in these high quantities, watching multiple movies a day for enjoyment, for the pleasures it brings me, for education, because I want to learn more about the craft or the world or the artistry? Or am I doing it because I've constructed an identity out of watching movies and I don't know what else to do to fill my time? And so, yeah, I do think there is a danger to, soaking oneself in film. Not to say you shouldn't. I guess if I were to, take Wells's quote and modify it, I think it's okay to soak yourself in film, but you should also come up for air every so often because film alone is not enough. What reviews, besides Andrei Rublev, do you look back with embarrassment and for what reason? So, kind of lots. I've been on Letterboxd since the early to mid 2010s, so there's all sorts of reviews from different parts of my life where the writing is worse, where I'm younger, the takes are more, I guess, questionable, and there are all sorts of reviews that I could look back on and cringe at aspects of them from the tone of the writing or the flaws in the writing to the star rating to, what I'm responding to in the first place. But at the same time, I also think it's kind of embarrassing, but it's also, I don't want to dwell on it too much in this kind of way of being wrong about these movies because ultimately they're still valid as far as a reflection of how I felt at a given moment. The Andrei Rublev one is a perfect example. Do I think I was wrong about the movie? Yeah, I do. Do I cringe at how I talk about it in that 2-star review? Yes, of course I do. But is it also reflective of where I was at that precise moment in time when I saw it and reflecting a moment where I was trying earnestly to engage with great cinema, but also a kind of movie that for the exact place I was in was really not conducive to something that was going to be beneficial for me then? Yeah, it was. So yes, I am embarrassed by certain Letterboxd reviews, but also at the end of the day, they also serve a purpose and are illuminating to some aspect of my life at a given point that I can't really begrudge them too much. What's the most you've ever agreed or disagreed with Roger Ebert or any other prominent film critic? We'll stick with Ebert. I have always taken umbrage with Ebert's just hardline stance against movie violence, this very moralistic objection on two different fronts, two different extremes. Because on the one hand, you have him and Siskel scandalized by the Friday the 13th movies and how violent and trashy and repulsive they were. And I don't like most of those movies either. I think they're pretty bad and dumb, but they're also dumb cartoons, man. To be so morally outraged about some of these movies strikes me as being morally outraged about Wile E. Coyote smashing into a rock. It's very silly. I don't get being that upset. But on the other end of the spectrum, you have Ebert's objections to something like Blue Velvet, which on the one hand I think is much more reasonable because, well, here is a film that is genuinely upsetting and I can see why it would trigger such a powerful emotional reaction and revulsion, but it also would strike me that he would get so consumed by this reaction that he would lose the plot and would just be on this moralistic crusade that bypassed seeing anything else about the movies, and was one of his, I think, biggest weaknesses as a writer. Curiously, though, if you read through the sort of course of his reviews, you do see him almost give up on this battle. I'm especially thinking about his review for the remake of The Last House on the Left in 2009, but he's talking about a scene where the parents, to get revenge on the villains, put one of their heads in a microwave and turn it on and the head explodes. And he talks about seeing debate online on IMDb about if you could actually microwave someone's head like they do in the movie, if that would work, because the door is open and microwaves are programmed so that they won't actually run. They can't work if the door is wide open. And he has this comment about, I see people debating about if you could actually do this and no one talking about why it's there at all or if it's necessary. And you just feel the energy of this sad old man just being I lost. What is your preferred movie snack and what is your take on dinner service in theaters? Is it worth it or is it too distracting on a sensory level? I love popcorn. I love popcorn since I was a wee lad. I think I will be eating popcorn on my deathbed, if I'm being honest. Full dinners in the theater? No, this shit is too far. You're here to watch a movie. Snacks are great. Treats are great. I'm not even going to get bent out of shape about, the crinkling of, candy bags in the theater. It's fine. Comes with the territory. When you have people eating full-blown meals, go to dinner. And I'm saying this as someone fortunate enough, I don't live by an Alamo Draft House, so I'm not watching movies where people are having waiters coming up and taking their orders. So I'm not even at that extreme. And I still am like, no, too much. Will you do more analysis/documentaries akin to That's Entertainment? If you're talking about doing videos that are like these deep historical dives into different eras and chronicle decades of film transformation and classic Hollywood, for sure, definitely. If you're talking about finding subjects similar to the That's Entertainment documentaries, I don't know. Just because those docs, part of why I wanted to do that video at all, the This Was Entertainment deep dive into Hollywood musicals, is the That's Entertainment films just seemed so unique and interesting to me, and such a specific product of the time they were made, especially the first one. And I don't know if that's something there's really other opportunities for, but maybe I'm wrong. You've mentioned in videos before that you've shown certain films to undergrad students and whatnot, and that has got me wondering, what do you do outside of YouTube? Do you work as a film studies professor, or is it something else? I went to grad school for a long time, and in that experience, I worked as a teaching assistant. I worked as a co-professor of different or co-instructor, I suppose would be the more accurate term, for courses. I've taught my own courses, actually several of them multiple times. So yeah, I've had experience as a film teacher at a university level, and hope to be teaching in other capacities again in the future. I've been wondering if the podcast is coming back anytime soon or ever. Used to listen to you and Ian religiously every week on Spotify. The Cinema in Seconds podcast, yes. This is the show that I do with my friend Ian. We talk about little moments in great movies and why they're great. We took a hiatus at the beginning of this year, mostly just on my end. I was just really feeling overwhelmed and busy and needed to drop something, and that was the thing to do. We are back, doing episodes again. And, right now we're on, I guess, kind of a break because Ian's on vacation, but that's only for like a week or so. We'll be doing another episode soon, and we've got new episodes that have come since. So there are new podcast episodes up, and more are coming in the future, and it's good to be back at it. What does your script writing process look like, and how do you find the motivation to write so consistently? I'm always impressed with the speed at which you put out videos without sacrificing quality. Well, that's very nice of you to say, because I always feel like I'm like way behind on keeping up with any kind of regular schedule, and I'm too sporadic in my uploading schedule, which maybe isn't true. Maybe people don't feel that way. In terms of staying motivated, I think something that really has helped me is I have a dedicated notebook just for writing down like ideas for videos, not for full-blown notes, just like titles for what a video could be, because sometimes you get inspiration at an inopportune moment for what could be a good video, and it's like, I don't have time to work on this now. Jot down the idea, then when there is time, I have this book that I can go back to and be like, oh, that's something that I can do now. The other thing that helps me keep motivation is that, for better or worse, I've generally avoided thinking about what would be the most marketable or the most successful or the YouTube algorithm, or even, if we're being honest, what my audience would most want to see. And I kind of just do the videos, topics that interest me at a given moment, and that kind of makes all the difference. The High Noon Rio Bravo video ended up becoming much more labor intensive than I thought it would. The research process became more involved as I kept stumbling down other rabbit holes of like, okay, I have to go into this, I have to learn about this, talk about this. The script got longer and longer as I wrote, which of course ballooned the editing process, led to me thinking I really should get a little extra oomph for this one, leading to me filming bits in a movie theater for the concluding section. All of this really added to the workload and made it harder to maintain on a strict level of the labor of it. But it's also because, I was working on something that I really loved and was passionate about, and so these kinds of rabbit holes and expansions of the workload, while they were daunting, they were also exciting, and I was having fun. So yeah, I think having dedicated notebook to track or to jot down ideas so that they're there when I need them, and being just true to what interests me rather than doing videos because I think, this is a good thing to make for YouTube. That's really what keeps me motivated the most. What books would you recommend in terms of getting into film theory, and which ones have been most personally influential to you? I will recommend very much what I was assigned as an undergraduate, Film Theory and Criticism Introductory Readings, which is a very standard textbook across film programs in academia that is a really great sort of collection of fundamental essays in film theory that cover a range of topics from authorship and artistry to industry and film as business even, or as like the sort of infrastructure of how films are made, psychoanalysis, gender, race, sexuality. Like, it's a broad spectrum, and what's great is the way it's organized, you really can kind of look through and see what interests you and what doesn't and read around that. But also you can see in reading the different essays where there is still crossover, where there's still, even if you're doing film analysis, you're still talking about formalism. Even if you're talking about genre, you can still cross over into authorship or gender or sexuality or race. Like, these categories and theories, while they are distinct, they're also not mutually exclusive. And so you bolster your reading by taking in the differences, and it's a really good collection. It's also very accessible. You can buy them in like university campus bookstores, new textbooks, for the high prices they go for, but this has been published in multiple editions with various changes many times. You can find used copies all over the place. You can find all sorts of PDFs uploaded online for free, which I would highly recommend just downloading one, because it's a great resource to have, and there's lots of great readings in there. And especially if you're looking for like the fundamental, foundational framework for thinking about film theory, I think that is the go-to introductory text. There's a reason why it's the standard in universities. What do you think about music videos? What's your favorite? I don't think I'm particularly well versed in music video for two main reasons. One, I think generationally, I'm very much of the age of kids who would engage with music primarily on MP3 players and iPods on the way to school. And there it's purely just the songs. I'm not that I didn't see music videos, but I was detached from the kind of video aspect of it. And two, because I primarily listen to heavy metal, and I would say that's a genre that, unlike pop music, which had put a lot of resources and ambition into music videos, metal, there's less money to go around, and certainly the bands are less interested in putting out those kinds of video projects. There's a reason why the most famous metal video maybe ever is Metallica's One, where most of it is licensed footage from a classic movie, and that it's an amazing music video, but it's kind of telling. As far as ones though that I really like, I mean, One would be an example. Nine Inch Nails is closer, and I would say Rob Zombie's stuff, both as his solo act and when he was with White Zombie, and this is both when he was directing videos himself, but even before. You can see his cinematic interests and background in both what he's pulling from, but also what he's trying to do himself, and it gives his videos much more personality and spark. There are so many great movies featuring punk music in the narrative / on the soundtrack, or just with the same vibes as punk music. But as a noted metal fan, what are some of the best metal movies that should be on my radar? Well, for one, there's the classic animated film Heavy Metal, the science fiction fantasy with the hard rockin' soundtrack. Not fully hard rockin', admittedly. If I were making a movie called Heavy Metal, I probably wouldn't put Devo on the soundtrack. No disrespect to Devo, I like Devo, but their metal bona fides are kinda sus. But on the other hand, you also have that amazing sequence set to Black Sabbath's E5150 / Mob Rules that is just awesome. Penelope Sphere's The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years, even though it should be noted, this is not a fun metal movie. It is a kind of scathing portrait of the hair metal scene in the 80s, both the inherent sleaze of the era and in LA, and also just this shameless clout-chasing bands trying to cash in on the success of bands like Motley Crue, none of which that are profiled in the documentary really had any success at all, and they're all terrible. It's also a very tense experience if you're a metal fan. There are some fun scenes, fun metal stuff. The Ozzy interview is famously a real highlight, but I remember watching that movie, and every time they were interviewing someone from a band that I liked, I was just sitting there so tense, like, just don't fucking embarrass me. Don't say anything stupid. God damn it. And so often I was let down. But it is a very interesting viewing. And as far as, the metal vibes of it, there is something to it in how it accidentally paints a really good portrait of why thrash metal would be so well received in that climate. Because you look at so many of these bands and they are so transparently chasing cash and making shitty music that you can see why bands would respond really positively to, or why audiences rather would respond really positively to early Metallica, early Slayer, early Megadeth, who do show up at the end and basically climax the film. And you can see why that the appeal of that subgenre. And also that poster with Dave Mustaine is like quintessential metal goodness. Also, shout out to Sound of Metal, specifically because so many times in movies when metal is evoked, it's a shorthand for either deeply stupid characters or for bullies and shitty people. And I'm not saying I'm inherently against this. Like, I love Beavis and Butthead, so I'm not going to tell you, like, how dare they sully our good reputation. But it was nice to watch a movie where a main character was in a metal band and loved metal and was, like, a dignified, respectable character who you empathized with and cared for. Favorite metal albums? You've talked about your love for metal music before, and I'm just wondering, are there any new bands you've discovered recently? Doesn't have to be modern bands, just ones you've been jamming to recently. Best to do these together, and I'm not going to name all the metal bands I love because, you know, there's only so many hours in a day, and it would just turn into me being like, oh yeah, those guys, they're pretty good. But I will highlight one band, and it's a band that I have discovered recently and been jamming to a lot recently, and they are a modern band as well, and that is Blood Incantation, and especially their album Absolute Elsewhere, which, when it was released, was like a real sort of caused quite a stir in metal communities and was kind of immediately recognized as a major work in the genre. And when I finally listened to it, I was almost overwhelmed by how moving and powerful it was and how sonically satisfying, and it was something where, as I've gotten older, I have diversified my music tastes and expanded, and I listen to other types of music more than I used to when I was young and not just metal. And that on the whole, I'd say, is good. It's good to engage with other kinds of art and with forms of art that can do things that heavy metal by and large doesn't. But listening to Absolute Elsewhere and feeling that overwhelming power was a great reminder that no matter what, nothing else in the world does it for me quite like heavy metal, and Absolute Elsewhere is metal at its absolute best. It is a masterpiece of the genre and has made me I hope to be lifelong fan of this band because they're amazing, and I cannot wait for whatever they have next. And that's how we're wrapping up this Q&A with go listen to Blood Incantation by Absolute Elsewhere. It's a great record. Even if all you listen to is Perry Como, it's time for Blood Incantation.